Then go ahead and send it home. Just like that. Check our crank mark. Dead at 6 o'clock, and our cam mark is dead at 12 o'clock. So our engine is in time, we're good to go. We can move on to our next step. Go ahead and get them placed directly on the dowels. There we go, it just kind of falls into place. So now both the cylinder heads are fully installed. Now we're going to move on to installing the push rods and the rocker arms, and this is the part I really want you guys to pay attention to. This is the part that so many people struggle with, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. It's almost like they put all of their attention, all of their focus into making sure that the heads get torqued down correctly, and then they kind of lose focus after that, and this is where they make a mistake. But it's not really tricky, it's just a little bit finicky, and you want to take your time, make sure you get it right. So when you're putting your push rods back in, you have longer push rods and you have shorter push rods. Now the longer push rods go to your exhaust valves down here. So you go ahead and slide them into those holes. You should feel, when you actually push the push rod in there, you should feel it contact the back edge of the lifter, and even it will push the lifter in a little bit until it makes contact with the cam lobe. Feel that motion of it hitting the actual lifter and it moving just a little bit. That's how you know you've gotten it fully seated in there. Right, I just pushed it in about a ½ inch. I could feel it go whoop, right into place. So let's go ahead and get all these exhaust ones put into place. You could hear that, I hope, of the lifter moving. There we go. And our last exhaust one. All right, this one's already up against the cam lobe, but you can feel that it is seated in the edge of the lifter, or the bottom of the lifter itself. Now, the shorter push rods go to the top and they go to your intake ports. Now these ones, they're a little bit harder to find. A lot of people make a mistake and try to put their push rod over here somewhere. That's not where the hole is, it's over here on this side. Same thing, you should feel it contact that lifter, and you should feel the lifter move until it contacts the cam lobe itself. If you don't feel that, you don't have it centered in the lifter edge properly, and that is where most people make their mistake. Okay, so I felt all of those move just a tiny amount. We know we're in good shape there. Now it's time to get our rocker arms on. Now when I do this, I always recommend that you do the exhaust side first because it lays on there much more easily, and it is far easier to get all of these push rods seated in the holes like they're supposed to be. Again, I do wish I'd have been able to hot tank these parts a little bit so that they'd be a little bit nicer here coming in. But you know, a lot of you guys aren't going to have access to that either, so why should I? What you want to do is get all of these bolts started before you tighten any of them down. And what we're looking for here is on the push rods themselves, they'll go into these little cups on the rockers. What you're trying to do is make sure that those are fully seated in the cup as you're tightening the bolts down. And that will actually help to hold the whole rocker assembly in place. The exhaust side is really easy because even after it's completely tightened down, you can actually physically verify whether or not the push rods are fully seated. The intake side is a little bit of a different story, and that's where most people run into their trouble. When they put the intake side on, they think they've got all those push rods in place, but a lot of times it's cocked up on the edge of the cup instead of actually in the cup. Like it'll be sitting right here, and as soon as they go to fire the engine, it goes plink and comes out, and then it's down a cylinder. Then they have to pull the valve covers back off and figure out what's going on. So again, the intake side is the tricky side. Once you get this intake side fully tightened down, the rockers, and you think everything's in place, you need to go in there and feel with your finger and make sure that that push rod is fully seated into that rocker. And I would say additionally, as a step beyond that, before you put your valve covers on, go ahead and spin the engine over at least 3 or 4 rotations. Make sure you see every single one of these valves actuating before you put that valve cover on. It'll save you a lot of struggle down the road. Now while we're tightening these rocker arms down, we're going to tighten these things down to 16 foot-pounds. And again, try to do it as evenly as possible, like a little tightening here and there, because you don't want to tighten one end and then have the other end all kicked up. So try to tighten them as evenly as possible. All right, so the exhaust side is done. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the intake side. Now the intake side is tougher for another reason too, because their push rod lengths will be wildly different. So getting the rocker arms to really tighten down evenly can be a challenge. That's why I say just go real slow, take your time, don't rush this part of the process. Also, the intake rockers will be marked with an I. That way you know that they are in fact the intake. Now they do in fact make a little tool that's supposed to do this for you as far as lining up those push rods and holding them in place. It's a little plastic tool that bolts down, I think, to where the valve cover would go. I can't really remember, but the point is it's just a little plastic tool that's supposed to hold those push rods in place. And then after you bolt this thing down, you can pop it out. In my opinion, it's almost not really even better than just doing it by hand anyway. It's such a pain to work with that tool. So I don't really think the tool is worth it. I think it just makes more sense just to do it by hand. All right, now we've got all the rockers on there. Let me go ahead and make a feel here. All right, feels like we have all of our rockers in place. I'm gonna go ahead and spin the engine over a couple of times and verify that each and every one of these valves is opening before I actually move on. Obviously, you also wanna make sure that there's no binding of any kind, that the actual crank will still spin smoothly all the way through its strokes. So, I think I just heard one of them pop into place there, so it must have been slightly out. All right, so if you heard that ting noise, that was a push rod that was slightly sitting up inside the cup and not fully seated. But as soon as we spun it over, it actually popped into place. Whoop. Now what we want to do, now that we've actually made a couple of cycles, is take one more pass on these rocker arms and make sure that they are torqued to the proper spec. And then this side is all done. Cool, this side's done. Let's go ahead and get the passenger side done. Oh man, I apologize you guys for my profuse sweating. It is hot in Texas in August, no question about it. Now we got our rocker arms installed here. They're all torqued down. Everything's good to go. I ran it through a few cycles. All the valves are opening like they should. I think we're in good shape. I'm gonna go ahead and throw a new set of spark plugs in this thing, and then we're gonna go ahead and put the valve covers back on with new valve cover gaskets. After that, we're gonna put the engine mounts on. We're gonna put the exhaust manifolds on. We're also going to put the front crank damper or crank pulley back on there. Then we'll flip it upside down, do the oil pan gasket, an oil pan with an oil pickup tube. At that point, the engine's basically ready to go back in the truck. So we're trucking right along on this thing, no pun intended, and we're doing a good job. So let's get after it. Well, the time has come to put our valve covers back on. Now, as you can see, these are a darn sight better than they were when I took them off. There's still a little bit of oil buildup here in certain areas, but it's certainly not the 1/4 inch thick sludge that it was originally. And I think this is plenty good enough to stick this thing back on. So let's go ahead and put it back on there. All right, so we've got this engine flipped upside down. Now we're gonna go ahead and put on the windage tray, which also doubles as the oil pan gasket. Now the only thing I wanna point out here is that these joints here, where the steel of the block meets the aluminum of the rear main seal and the front timing cover, right at those joints is where you're gonna put just a little bit of RTV silicone, just right on these edges, and that is all. No other place do you need it, just on those edges, because there could be some various imperfections in the height between the two, and that's why you use a little bit of silicone right there. Also, the other thing I want to point out is that you cannot put the oil pickup tube on until you actually have that oil pan gasket in place. So put the oil pan gasket on first, then you can put your pickup tube on, and then you can put your oil pan on.
Couple of things to mention about the oil pan pickup tube. One is that you always want to put a new pickup tube O-ring on there. It is very easy for these O-rings to become deformed or also cut or split to where they just fall off and you don't really notice. Then you go to put this thing all together and all of a sudden you have really low oil pressure or no oil pressure. So very important to change out that little pickup tube O-ring. Now also secondly, anytime you're dealing with an engine that has had some sort of catastrophic failure where there's a lot of different metal bits floating around in the engine, honestly, I don't recommend reusing the original pickup tube. It's too easy for metal to get caught up in here and just basically stick somewhere inside the pickup tube. No matter how much you clean it, seems like a lot of times it'll stick in there. I've done this quite a few different times, so I know a few things about how to get all of that junk out of there. So again, I definitely recommend if you can, just go ahead and buy another pickup tube. That way you can save yourself the time and effort, because honestly, these things are pretty cheap overall. I just didn't have time to get a new one here, so I went ahead and cleaned this one out, and I know for a fact that this one is fully clear, ready to go, so I'm going to reuse it. But again, my recommendation, if you're dealing with an engine that has had a catastrophic failure, just buy a new pickup tube. Now the oil pan can be a little bit easier because you do have good access to all of the little nooks and crannies in here, so cleaning it out isn't too bad. I will say that on the aluminum pans, they are a lot more difficult because there's a lot more crevices in there, a lot more cracks. If you are uncomfortable trying to get it fully clean, just get another oil pan as well. The steel ones especially are not that expensive to get a new one. The aluminum ones can be a little bit harder to find, a little bit more money, but if you are uncomfortable with the amount of material or metal that has gotten trapped in the little areas that you feel like you can't get all of it out, just go ahead and get a different one. Now you notice that I'm actually hand starting all of these oil pan bolts. These are very small and they can be very easy to cross thread. So go ahead and hand start them, and I'm also going to finish them by hand. I'm not going to use any sort of a gun to draw these things down. It doesn't take that long to go ahead and just run them down by hand, and then you can know that they are tight to the proper degree. You'll notice as well that I'm using a 1/4 inch ratchet with a very short throw on here. That is because these do not need to be that tight. You know, you don't need to take a 3/8 ratchet and just crank on it until they stop moving, because first of all, you're going to snap the heads off of these things or get them stuck in the threads. So a little 1/4 inch ratchet there, just tighten them down firm. That's as much as you need. You do not need to crank on these things. We've done it. Our Hemi engine refresh is all back together again. The engine is ready to be dropped back into the vehicle. But real quick, before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and build a lifting plate for this motor, because honestly, you know, I've taken these engines out hundreds of times and I keep using a chain across it and it's a little bit janky. I don't like it, so I'm going to go ahead and build a lifting plate. I don't know why I haven't done one before now, but it's just gonna be something real quick that actually bolts here to the intake valley. We'll go ahead and get this thing fabbed up. That way we can get these engines yanked in and out with a lot less sketchiness. There we go. Went ahead and got this lifting plate all made up. You know, it took a little bit too long, and of course I made it a little bit more complicated than it actually needed to be. But I think it's gonna work out really well. You see it has these offset pedestals on the bottom because it actually needs to be able to raise itself up over the cam hump here at the top of the block. So the reason I haven't made one of these beforehand is that there's really just these two fasteners dead center of the intake. They're little 6mm bolts. Honestly, you don't feel comfortable lifting off of them, but the factory lift plate actually bolts here and then it goes across and actually connects to this front timing cover bolt here. However, a lot of times when I'm pulling these engines, they don't have a timing cover on them, so I can't use that anyway. So realistically, I'm just using these center two bolts anyway. So why not build my own lifting plate that bolts right into place, and then I can pull these engines in and out without running a chain across them, and it's always super sketchy when I'm running a chain. So I'm happy I finally built this thing. Let's go ahead and use it. Just figured out the major negative of building the lifting strap the way I built it is that basically it has too much forward bias here, so the thing is tilting the wrong direction. Now I can easily adjust that using a little tie strap from here to here, which is probably what I'll do for this install. However, I am going to go ahead and drill some holes in the forward facing side of this lifting strap, and that way I can hook up for there, and that'll shift my weight point forward a little bit, and I think that'll help quite a bit. But for now, we're just gonna go ahead and go with the strap method to really fine tune it. One of the final things that we need to do before we actually install this is to go ahead and put the flex plate back on. And you'll want to, there's a little spacer guy right here. You'll want to put this on before you put the flex plate on. It's much easier to fit it on here now. One other tip, when you're putting your flex plate back on, definitely make sure you're using some form of Loctite.
You do not want these bolts to back off. Flex plate bolts get torqued down to 70 foot-pounds. Same thing, you can just use a pry bar against the dowel pins. All right, the engine is officially ready to drop back into the truck. Let's go ahead and get this thing slapped back in there. I'm ready to get this truck all back together again and get it fired up. I want to see how it drives.